Europe after the Napoleonic Wars is a strange place. On the maps there are still crowns, coats of arms, borders painted in solemn colors, and names that sound like eternity. Kingdoms, empires, royal houses that have been repeating the same rituals for centuries. But if you stop and look calmly, as if you were listening to a room in silence, you notice something new. A kind of power that does not come in through the main door, but through the service stairs. For decades, Europe had lived under the logic of great names and great families. Authority was something visible, a throne, a court, an army, a lineage that could be recited like a prayer. And suddenly, after the Napoleonic earthquake, many of those symbols are still there, but they do not weigh the same. Kings still sign decrees, but they depend more and more on ministers. Aristocrats still hold banquets, but the world begins to be decided in less elegant places, in offices, in banks, in workshops, in rooms filled with blueprints, numbers, and smoke. Because Napoleon's war did not only change borders, it changed the sense of what was possible. It showed that a man without royal blood could shake the whole continent if he understood the moment and mastered the machinery that moved it. And when his empire collapsed, it left behind an uncomfortable lesson for the old elites. The world no longer obeyed tradition alone. It was beginning to obey organization, technology, the ability to produce, to move, to feed, to equip. On the surface, the monarchical restoration tried to return to order. Thrones were given back, ceremonies were rebuilt. It was pretended that the monster had been locked away and that the 18th century could continue. But beneath that surface, reality was already sliding in another direction. The 19th century was going to be, increasingly, the century of the invisible lever, not the lever of protocol, but the lever of the machine, not the power inherited by blood, but the power built by capability. And here the central idea of this documentary appears. While the thrones were wobbling, another kind of authority was growing in silence. It did not need to be proclaimed with trumpets. It did not need a coronation. It only needed results. Because the new power was not going to present itself as divine right. It was going to present itself as a solution, as a railway line that cuts a journey from days to hours, as a cable that carries a message in minutes instead of weeks, as a factory that mass produces what used to be handmade, as an engine that turns movement into a promise of future, and whoever controlled that would control the century. There is a twist we sometimes forget when we look at history. For a long time it was believed that Europe was governed by kings, and that is true in part. But as the 19th century moved forward, power began to move house. It shifted from the throne room to the office, from the coat of arms to the balance sheet, from the surname to the patent, from the castle to the industrial plant. And when the world realized that this move had happened, it was already too late to stop it. If the 18th century was the age of crowns, the 19th and the 20th would be the age of factories. That sentence may sound exaggerated, even provocative, but it contains a truth that is hard to ignore. Industry was going to decide which countries modernized, which fell behind, who could sustain an army, who could feed growing cities, who could finance long wars, and who could not. Industry was going to dictate rhythms, and politics was going to run behind, trying to translate them into laws and speeches. On that new board, Germany, or rather what was not yet Germany, becomes the perfect terrain. And here is the paradox that changes everything. Germany, for a good part of the 19th century, is not a unified country. It is not France with its strong center. It is not the United Kingdom with its consolidated identity. It is a mosaic. Kingdoms, duchies, principalities, free cities, territories with different rules, different currencies, borders that you can cross in a few hours of travel. From the outside, it looks like a weakness, a chaos, an inevitable delay. But that very chaos produces something that Europe does not yet fully understand: internal competition. Competition between small states that want to prosper without being able to expand through colonies like the British, without a centralized empire like the French. How do they compete then? With organization, with education, with technique, with efficiency. And that is where a new kind of human being begins to take shape, one who will become decisive. The engineer as a figure of prestige. Not the aristocrat who commands because it is his turn, but the man, and in time, also the woman, although almost always made invisible. Who knows how to make things work? Who knows how to turn coal into useful energy? Who knows how to design a bridge that holds? Who knows how to build a machine that produces 10 times more? Who knows how to measure, calculate, standardize? Germany, politically fragmented, becomes obsessed with technical education. Schools, polytechnics, workshops that look like laboratories are built. Discipline becomes a culture. Precision becomes a virtue. Organization becomes a form of national pride, even before a complete nation exists. And, in that environment, a new kind of elite is born. Entrepreneurs and industrialists who do not need pedigree to be inevitable. What we are really seeing is the birth of new dynasties. Dynasties without blue blood. Families that do not inherit crowns but inherit companies. Families that do not sit on thrones but sit on boards. Families that have no heraldic shields but have brands. And most importantly, families that, by controlling the infrastructure of the modern world, begin to control the modern world. Because a factory is not just a building. It is a chain of decisions. It is a system of wages and discipline. It is a network of suppliers and markets. It is an intimate relationship with the state, sometimes as client, sometimes as partner, sometimes as prisoner, sometimes as master. A large company does not live in isolation. It lives connected to everything, to politics, to war, to culture, to science, to work, to human suffering, to national pride. And as it grows, its influence becomes as real as any decree. Here a question opens that runs through this whole documentary. Because if today we look back, we usually remember the names of kings, emperors, prime ministers. But who really ruled modern Europe when the kings no longer understood the world they were creating? The question is not an empty provocation. It is a doorway. Because in the 19th and 20th centuries, many life-changing decisions are made outside palaces. They are made in offices full of blueprints, in rooms where it is decided where a railway line will go, and with it, which region will prosper and which will empty out. In rooms where a loan is approved that saves a state or sinks it. At tables where it is decided whether a new technology will be used to light cities or to perfect the capacity to kill. And this is where we begin to see the outline of the protagonists of this story. They are not monarchs with capes. They are industrialists with ambition, engineers with obsession, families who understand before anyone else that the new power is not in the crown, but in the control of what is essential: energy, steel, transport, communication, engines. In the 18th century, if you wanted to change the fate of Europe, you needed a marriage alliance, an army, or a hereditary right that placed you in the right position. In the 19th century, more and more, you need something else. You need productive capacity. You need to turn raw materials into systems. You need to master the language of the modern. And Germany, that country that does not yet exist as a single nation, begins to work as if it already were a power. That is the unsettling detail. While other states see themselves as the present, Germany sees itself as what is coming. And that gaze toward the future, joined to a brutally efficient technical ecosystem, creates the perfect breeding ground for titans to be born. Titan is a big word, but here it is not a metaphor. Because the names we will see, Siemens, Porsche, and other German giants, are going to shape railways, engines, electrical grids, communications, weaponry, reconstruction, consumption, luxury, mobility, and even the way we understand progress. Their decisions will cross paths with world wars, with dark regimes, with economic collapses, with miraculous rebirths. And, most disturbingly, many times they will do so without the public seeing them as rulers. They will be for most people simply companies, brands, technology, products. But in a modern world, the line between company and power is thinner than it seems. So before we enter the concrete history of Siemens, Porsche, and the German titans, we need to take a step back and look at the stage. Not the stage of the usual great empires, but that of a fragmented territory that, precisely because it is fragmented, learned to compete in a new way. We need to understand the country that did not exist, but was already working as if it were a power. Germany. Before Germany is not a nation. It is a scattered idea, a shared language in regions that agree on almost nothing. A map that looks like it was made of scraps, medium-sized kingdoms, small duchies, free cities, ecclesiastical territories, borders. You can cross in a morning's journey, customs posts that appear where they should not, different currencies, different laws, and constant rivalry between neighbors who, in theory, belong to the same cultural world. From the outside, that mosaic looks like a problem. And it was, many times. But it was also a motor. Because when you do not have a single center that controls everything, each region is forced to prove that it can prosper on its own. And when you cannot compete with great colonial empires, when you cannot boast of oceans and distant routes like the United Kingdom, when you cannot impose your diplomatic weight with the centralized elegance of France, you are left with another option: turning your own territory into a laboratory. That word, laboratory, is not a pretty metaphor. It is almost literal. Because in that fragmented space, modernity is experimented with in pieces. Each state tests its own model. Each court wants its industry. Each city wants its railway. Each administration wants its education system. And because there is competition, the pressure is real. If your neighbor organizes production better, he will attract capital, attract workers, attract prestige. If your neighbor builds an efficient railway line first, your market shrinks. If your neighbor creates a technical school that produces brilliant engineers, your industry is left behind. This is how a culture is born in which progress is not a luxury but a necessity. One of the first keys lies in something that, at first glance, does not sound epic. Technical universities, polytechnics, training centers that are not designed for philosophy or literature, though that exists too, but to solve concrete problems: metallurgy, chemistry, mechanics, electricity, bridges, machines, processes, organization. It is not only about knowing, but about applying. Not only about knowledge, but about production. And that changes the kind of social prestige. In many parts of Europe, prestige is still measured by surname, by rank, by access to court. In that German ecosystem, especially in the regions where industry begins to grow strongly, prestige starts to come from somewhere else, from technical competence, from the ability to design something that works, from turning an idea into a system, from mastering the language of standards, measurement, performance. In this world, genius does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears an apron, or a dark suit with coal stains in the imagination. Here, another element comes in that is not uniform across the whole territory, but is influential in much of it: Protestant ethics and bureaucratic culture. Not as simplistic morality, but as a way of organizing social life. Work as discipline, saving as virtue, record-keeping as obsession, order as guarantee. In practice, this translates into administrations that, although sometimes rigid, develop something crucial for industry: continuity, rules, procedures, the ability to repeat a process 1,000 times without it breaking due to improvisation. Because industry needs that. It needs one screw to be identical to the previous one. It needs one part to fit another without relying on luck. It needs time to be measured and respected. It needs supply routes to work. It needs contracts to carry real weight. It needs the state, which can be an obstacle or an ally, to be predictable. And in that predictability, Germany finds a quiet advantage: the obsession with standards and precision. It is not only a cultural issue, it is a practical one. If you have many states and want to trade among them, you need to harmonize measures, gauges, systems. If you want to compete with greater powers, you need your quality to be so high that it is impossible to ignore. If you want your machinery to sell abroad, you need it to work better, last longer, be repairable, inspire confidence. It is at this point that the modern myth of German engineering begins to take shape. Not as propaganda, but as the result of an ecosystem that rewards exactitude and punishes error. But one decisive piece is still missing: the state, in particular the Prussian state. Prussia is not simply another German kingdom, it is a model. A state built around administration, the army, discipline, the idea that strength is not just numbers, but organization, and that state becomes a huge industrial client. Not only because it needs weapons, uniforms, logistics, railways, communications, but because it understands that to exist as a power, it needs its own industry. It needs to reduce dependence. It needs to turn science and technique into power. In other words, Prussia pays for modernity. And when a state pays for modernity, it creates markets, it creates companies, it creates networks of suppliers, it creates careers for engineers and entrepreneurs who might otherwise not have found space. It is not that the Prussian state invents industry by itself. It is that it feeds it. It gives it demand. It gives it contracts. It gives it challenges that force innovation, and by doing so, it turns industrial development into something almost strategic. It is not just economics, it is survival. Here it is worth comparing with the two great benchmarks of the time, because it helps to understand German uniqueness. The United Kingdom industrializes earlier. It has coal, it has ports, it has colonies, it has a global trade network. Its industrial revolution is born with force and generates a model in which capital and maritime trade are key. France, for its part, has a strong central state, a deep administrative tradition, and also industry, but with a different relationship between region and center, between state and market, between social prestige and enterprise. Germany arrives later as a unified nation, but when it accelerates, it does so with particular intensity. Because it does not start from a single capital, it starts from many. And that multiplicity generates a race. Each region wants to be indispensable. Each city wants to be a node. Each state wants its own version of modernity. And there is also a psychological and cultural element that weighs heavily. The feeling of, we are still not what we could be. That desire to prove oneself, to compensate, to build something that is beyond doubt. From that breeding ground come the figures that interest us. Men, for the most part, at the beginning, who are not born with a throne waiting for them, but with an insistent idea. The future can be built. And if it can be built, it can be controlled. That is why, when we talk about the German industrial titans, we are not only talking about brilliant individuals. We are talking about an ecosystem that makes them possible. A network of schools, workshops, administrations, small companies that grow, cities that transform, states that compete and, in competing, modernize. In this world, prestige does not come from surname, but from solving problems. That is the sentence that marks the change of era. Because if prestige comes from solving problems, then the one who solves more problems becomes more powerful. And the one who solves essential problems, energy, mobility, communication, becomes indispensable. And of all those problems, by the middle of the 19th century, one begins to shine like an almost magical promise. A phenomenon that still seems strange to most people, but that some already understand as the language of the future. Electricity. From that world of workshops, cables, and experiments, a man would emerge who did not dream of thrones, but of electricity. Werner von Siemens was not born to be a symbol of anything. He did not come into the world with a surname that opened doors in palaces, nor with a family fortune that allowed him to fail without consequences. His story begins far from the halls where Europe decides its destiny. It begins in a Germany that is still not Germany, in a country of uniforms, austere schools, cold workshops, and an almost obsessive idea of discipline. If you look at the 19th century from afar, it seems like a time dominated by great names, emperors, generals, bankers with solemn portraits. But if you zoom in, if you slip into the cracks of that history, you find people who were not meant to decide anything, and who nevertheless ended up changing everything. Siemens is one of them, and what makes him dangerous, in the historical sense, is not just his talent, but his persistence. He was born in 1816 into a large family in an environment where stability was fragile. It was not absolute misery, but that kind of life in which every decision matters, where studying is not an intellectual whim, but a bet against the future, where work is not chosen for romantic vocation, but for survival. And yet, in that context, Siemens finds a path, the Prussian army. It may sound strange to think of an engineer as a product of the army, but there lies one of the keys of this era. Prussia does not only train soldiers, it trains technicians, it trains officers who understand artillery, chemistry, metallurgy, logistics. It trains minds schooled in precision and problem-solving, and gives them something that, for a young man without privileges, is pure gold: training, structure, and access to a world where knowledge has practical use. Werner soon shows that he has something special. He is not the kind of genius who flashes once and disappears. He is the kind of mind that cannot help improving whatever it touches, that sees flaws in devices and thinks, this can be done better. That obsesses over the small detail because he senses that, in the whole, those details change the result. And as with many stories of innovation, the first steps are not a parade of successes. They are muddy ground, experiments that fail, ideas that do not work as they should, devices that promise more than they deliver, small investments that evaporate, the frustration of knowing you are close to something big but not quite able to grasp it. Here, the trait that defines Siemens appears: continuous improvement, almost as a compulsion. It is not just about inventing, but perfecting, turning a discovery into a reliable system. Because the industrial world does not reward the single spark, it rewards what can be repeated, sold, installed, maintained. And then electricity arrives. At that historical moment, electricity is still half science and half spectacle. It is the kind of phenomenon that, in some demonstrations, leaves people open-mouthed as if they were watching tamed magic. But for Siemens, it is not magic. It is a technical problem, an opportunity, a possible infrastructure. He begins with telegraphy, because that is one of the first places where electricity shows its real usefulness. Before the telegraph, information travels at the speed of a horse, a ship, a messenger. With the telegraph, information travels almost instantly. That not only changes commerce or journalism, it changes war, it changes politics, it changes the way a state coordinates with itself. If you control communication, you control reaction. In 1847, Werner von Siemens founds, together with Johann Georg Halske, a company that at first looks almost modest. A workshop, a beginning, a bet. Siemens and Halske. It is not yet the giant we associate with the name. It is a project that depends on orders, on contracts, on credibility, and above all, on its technology truly working. What sets Siemens apart from other inventors of the time is that he does not stop at the level of the idea. Siemens understands that the invention is not the end. It is the beginning. That to change the world, you have to enter the world. You have to negotiate with states, with railways, with cities, with businessmen. You have to build networks, not just devices. The company begins with telegraphy, but quickly expands into a more ambitious territory: electrification, lighting, motors, infrastructure, systems, the kind of technology that turns a city into a new organism. And here, something crucial happens for the narrative of this documentary. Siemens is not building a product company, he is building an era company. Each step towards electrification is not a one-off sale, it is a brick in a building that, if completed, will be indispensable for the functioning of modern society. Because once a city is electrified, it cannot go back. Once a factory depends on electric motors, it does not want to return to earlier systems. Once states organize communications and logistics with electricity, electricity becomes power. And Siemens senses this. Perhaps not with the conceptual clarity we have today, but with that instinct some pioneers have, knowing that you are opening a door that will not be closed again. But the path is not linear, and here it is worth humanizing him. Because founding a company in the 19th century is not like founding one today. There are no investment networks as we know them. There is no glamorous startup environment. There are real and personal risks. Reputation at stake, economic crises, competition, disputed patents, governments that change the conditions, projects that sink. And there is one more factor. Siemens is, from very early on, a family company. Not just because the founder puts his name on it, but because the organization grows with the logic of a modern clan. Brothers, relatives, trusted partners, people who share a vision and a discipline. That has advantages: loyalty, continuity, identity, but also risks, internal tension, dependence on specific individuals, the danger of confusing family with management. At this point, the viewer might think that Werner's story is the classic story of the inventor who prospers. But the real twist is not only in what he builds in life, it is in what he leaves prepared for after. Because Siemens does not end here. He does not end as a brilliant man who disappears and leaves a nice name in a book. What he is beginning to build is something that, in a world where power no longer wears a crown, looks very much like a new form of lineage, an industrial dynasty. His sons, his successors, his corporate structure, the internal culture formed around the surname, all of that begins to form a kind of continuity that recalls the old noble houses, but with an essential difference. Here, no throne is inherited, a machine is inherited. No territory is inherited, a network is inherited. The obedience of subjects is not inherited, the dependence of clients and states is inherited. And that inheritance can be even more lasting than a crown, because a crown can fall in a revolution, but an infrastructure, if it is necessary, always finds a way to survive. Here the rehook comes in, almost without needing to be underlined. Without realizing it, Siemens was creating something that would last much longer than his own life. Because at the moment when electricity begins to spread, Siemens ceases to be an individual. He becomes a surname turned into a system. And a system in the 19th century is the quietest way to rule. And the most disturbing thing of all is that, while Werner and his people are laying cables and designing devices, the old powers, many of them still wearing crowns, do not always understand what is happening. They see electricity as progress, as comfort, as modernization. They do not see that it is also dependence. Because if your city depends on a company for its electrical grid, your state begins to depend on that company for its stability. If your army depends on electric communications, your security depends on that technology. If your economy depends on electrified industrial systems, your wealth depends on whoever is able to maintain and improve them. Electricity did not only light up cities, it redrew power. Electricity does not arrive alone. It arrives accompanied by cables, poles, stations, contracts, political decisions. And above all, it arrives accompanied by a question that every state begins to ask itself without saying it aloud. Who controls this? Because as soon as electricity stops being a scientific curiosity and becomes infrastructure, it stops being neutral. It is no longer just progress, it is power. Power to move trains, to coordinate armies, to light factories that work at night, to transmit orders in real time. And that power is not in the hands of the king or the parliament or the army alone. It is, more and more, in the hands of those who know how to build, maintain, and expand those systems. Siemens understands this very early, not as a political theory, but as a practical reality. The company does not limit itself to selling devices, it sells complete solutions. Telegraph networks that cross entire territories, electrical systems that connect plants to cities, infrastructures that, once installed, become essential. The telegraph is perhaps the first serious warning. Before, a war was fought with slow information. Generals made decisions with days or weeks of delay. With the telegraph, the state begins to experience something new: centralized coordination. The possibility of reacting almost instantly, of directing operations from a distance, of governing a wide territory as if it were smaller. And there, the state discovers an uncomfortable dependence, because the telegraph is not managed directly by the king or the army. It is managed by a company, a private company, with engineers, technicians, patents, its own interests. A company that needs funding, stability, long-term contracts. The railway intensifies that relationship until it becomes irreversible. A train is not just a means of transport, it is pure logistics. It is the difference between feeding a city or letting it collapse, the difference between moving troops quickly or arriving late, the difference between integrating a territory or losing it. Railway lines, often electrified or dependent on advanced technical systems, become the arteries of the modern state. And whoever participates in their design and maintenance is no longer a simple supplier. He is a strategic partner. Here, something fundamental happens. The state begins to depend more on private companies than it would like to admit, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. Because it cannot do without them without paralyzing itself. And that dependence creates a new table of power. At that table, little by little, people begin to sit who wear no uniform and hold no noble title. Industrialists, engineers, company directors, people who speak in terms of costs, efficiency, deadlines, installed capacity, people who understand the world as a system that can be optimized. They do not come in through the grand door of traditional politics. They come in through the side door of usefulness, but once inside, it is hard to get them out. Because the king can change, the government can fall, but the infrastructure remains, and someone has to manage it. Here, the first great moral tension of this new era appears. Innovation does not distinguish between civilian and military uses. An electrical system that lights a city can also power an arms factory. A telegraph that coordinates trade also coordinates troops. A railway that carries food also carries cannons. Technology has no conscience. Conscience falls on those who decide how it is used, and that decision is many times not clean. For companies like Siemens, growth goes hand in hand with state contracts. And state contracts, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, almost always have a direct or indirect military dimension. Communications, logistics, energy, transport. Everything that makes a state work in peace makes it even more decisive in war. Here we are not talking about cartoonish evil or pure heroes. We are talking about a gray zone, of a world where refusing a contract can mean losing relevance, leaving room for a competitor, being left out of the future, and where accepting it means participating, even indirectly, in destructive capacity. It is at this point that industrialists begin to resemble, without realizing it, the old dynasties, not because they have castles or long genealogies, but because their position becomes structural. They do not depend only on the favor of the ruler of the day. They become too important to ignore. Like the nobles of old, they move between the private and the public worlds. They advise, they opine, they influence. Not always through public speeches, but through technical reports, discreet meetings, decisions that seem purely economic, but have enormous political consequences. And, like the old aristocratic houses, they begin to think in the long term, in continuity, in succession, in how to ensure that the company survives crises, regime changes, wars. They begin to build not only profits, but legacy. The difference is that this legacy is not sustained by tradition, but by usefulness. While a noble house could fall if it lost symbolic legitimacy, a company that controls critical infrastructure can survive even a radical change of political system. It can adapt, it can reinvent itself, it can negotiate its place in the new order. Here, the first clear parallel with the old European dynasties is drawn. Both understood something essential. That real power is not only in commanding, but in being necessary. That whoever becomes indispensable gains room to maneuver. That whoever controls what is essential can survive almost any storm. But Siemens is not alone in this game. While some electrify cities and connect states, others work with a material even older and more brutal. A material that has decided wars for centuries, and that, in the industrial age, reaches a new and terrifying scale. Because while electricity lights Europe, steel arms it. But Siemens was not the only one. While some lit up Europe, others forged its steel. The history of Krupp does not begin in a palace or a prestigious university. It begins where almost all the stories that change a continent begin, in a workshop that smells of coal, hot metal, and ambition. For a long time, Essen was just another point on the map of Western Germany. It was not Paris, it was not Vienna, it was not London. But in that landscape of smoke and chimneys, one family was about to discover something that the rest of Europe would take decades to accept. That the future would not be decided solely in parliaments and throne rooms, but in furnaces, forges, and factories. Krupp was just another surname until it stopped being one. At first, like so many others, it was a small, irregular business, vulnerable to competition and crises. And that detail matters, because it explains the character that formed inside. Heavy industry does not allow romanticism. It does not reward indecision. Either you control production, or production drags you under. In the 19th century, steel becomes the backbone of power. With steel, you make rails. With steel, you make bridges. With steel, you make machines. With steel, you make ships. And with steel, if someone asks you, or if you yourself push for it, you make cannons. Krupp's transition from workshop to giant does not happen in one blow. It happens as a chain of decisions that feed one another. One contract leads to another. One innovation creates an advantage. The advantage creates dependence in the client. And in this case, the most decisive client of all is the Prussian state, a state with an obsession to modernize in order to dominate. Prussia is not just a kingdom. It is an administrative and military machine. And a machine like that however disciplined, has a limit. Without industry, it cannot compete. It can have brave soldiers, but if its cannons are inferior, if its supplies arrive late, if its logistics fail, it loses. There, Krupp steps in. The relationship between Krupp and the Prussian army becomes intimate, almost symbiotic. The army needs quality steel, reliable production, constant innovation. Krupp needs contracts, stability, political backing, guaranteed demand. And when those two worlds connect, growth becomes explosive. At this point, the figure that defines the industrial dynasty appears, Alfred Krupp. He is not a crowned king, but he behaves like an absolute patriarch. In his world, the company is not a workplace, it is an organism. And he is the heart. His authority is not questioned, not because he has divine law, but because he controls the employment, production, and future of thousands of people. And here, one of the most unsettling elements of industrial power appears. It does not need moral legitimacy to grow. It needs efficiency, it needs capacity, it needs to deliver. Alfred Krupp understands that steel is not a product, it is a system. Controlling steel means controlling minds, transport, processes, technology, skilled labor. It means building a kind of industrial microstate inside the political state, and he does it. He creates a closed, almost military corporate culture. He demands loyalty. In return, he offers security, housing, social benefits that seem progressive for their time, but which also serve another purpose: tying people to the company, making Krupp not just an employer, but a destiny. Because if your house is Krupp, your school is Krupp, and your future depends on Krupp, how do you rebel against Krupp? That is one of the great paradoxes of the 19th century industrial age. The modern company brings real advances, but also builds new forms of control. Not feudal control, not monarchical control, but economic and social control. And meanwhile, the company perfects what will make it immortal: armaments. Here we should not soften things. Krupp becomes synonymous with cannons, with artillery, with firepower. If in the past armies were measured in men, increasingly they are measured in steel. European wars, which for centuries had been brutal, begin to become industrial as well. More scale, more speed, more destruction. And if there is one company that learns to produce for that scale, it is Krupp. Krupp cannons earn a reputation not only for being big, but for being reliable, precise, the products of obsessive engineering. And that reputation becomes influence. Because when a state depends on your weapons, it does not treat you like just another merchant, it treats you like someone who participates in its survival. At this point, industrial power shows its darkest face. It does not simply serve the state. Sometimes it pushes it, sometimes it conditions it, sometimes it creates incentives for conflict to be profitable. You do not need to imagine simple conspiracies. It is enough to understand the logic. If your business grows with rearmament, if your factories run at full capacity when there is international tension, your success depends, in part, on a dangerous world. And although no businessman controls, by himself, the foreign policy of a country, his weight can influence decisions, priorities, narratives. And here, the viewer can feel it. The 19th century did not only build progress, it built a machine that could devour everything else. That is why, when we talk about Krupp, we are talking about an industrial dynasty that resembles a royal dynasty, but with a disturbing nuance. Its crown is production, its army is the workers and the assembly lines. Its territory is the network of mines, factories, and contracts. And like every dynasty, it builds continuity. The surname becomes a brand, the company becomes a family legacy. And that legacy, as we hinted before, will survive wars, defeats, regime changes, but not without paying a price. Because steel sustains empires, yes, but it also sinks them. And when an empire sinks, it drags down with it those who fed it. Where there were cannons, there was Krupp. And where there was Krupp, there were irreversible decisions. The question is not whether Krupp had power. The question is what kind of power it was. A power not celebrated with coronations, but with orders. A power not measured in votes, but in tons. A power not inherited through blue blood, but through control of production. And once that power exists, states can no longer pretend they rule alone. Because industrial power did not only build states, it also pushed them to the limit. Industrial power did not only build states, it also pushed them to the limit. The First World War did not begin as an industrial war in people's imagination. It began for many as a continuation of the old European wars: uniforms, flags, anthems, grandiloquent speeches, a promise of quick victory. But the continent was about to discover something that would forever change the relationship between power and technology. Because in 1914, when Europe plunged into conflict, it did not only mobilize soldiers, it mobilized factories. And in that mobilization, companies like Siemens, Krupp, and other great German industrial houses were not secondary actors. They became part of the central mechanism of the state. In a total war, the front is not only the trench, it is also the workshop, the laboratory, the foundry, the railway that carries supplies, the office that calculates logistics, the cable that transmits orders. The first change is one of scale. An 18th century war could be sustained with limited arsenals and relatively artisanal production. The First World War devours ammunition like a bottomless beast. Artillery fires non-stop for days. Rifles need millions of cartridges. Shells become the currency of combat. Armies ask, demand, devour. And to feed that need, industry transforms itself. Factories extend shifts. Production lines are reorganized. Civil workshops are converted into military workshops. Processes are sped up. Everything that can be standardized is standardized. Every last detail is optimized. War becomes a gigantic engineering problem. How to produce faster, cheaper, more steadily, with fewer errors. In Germany, that transformation fits with something that already existed: an industrial culture obsessed with precision, planning, and discipline. But that technical advantage does not remove the human reality. It makes it worse. Because the more perfect production becomes, the more perfect destruction becomes. Krupp represents the most obvious face. If its steel was already tied to the army in the 19th century, it is now completely absorbed by the logic of conflict. Artillery, cannons, heavy pieces, they are not just products. They are the language spoken on the Western Front. Every offensive, every bombardment, every line of defense broken and rebuilt is linked to the capacity to produce metal and explosives. Siemens, for its part, does not appear in the popular imagination as a war factory, but its role is just as decisive along another path: infrastructures, communications, electrical components, control systems, technology applied to logistics. Modern war demands coordination. It demands information, it demands speed, it demands that the state function like a machine. And for that machine to work, it needs companies that know how to build its nerves. There lies the disturbing core of this part of the documentary. When a conflict becomes industrial, companies stop being suppliers and become gears. And the gear does not decide why it exists, it just turns. But the humans inside the gear do make decisions. As the months go by, the state applies more and more pressure. It does not just ask for production, it demands sacrifice. Labor is regulated, raw materials are controlled, military contracts are given priority. The entire economy is reorganized toward the war effort. The line between public and private blurs. The company is still a company, but its margin of decision narrows. It produces because the state demands it, and the state demands it because national survival seems to depend on it. It is easy to imagine this as a scene of unanimous patriotism, but the reality is murkier. Inside the companies and inside society, a moral tension grows. Because what does it mean to serve the country when the result is an endless slaughter? Propaganda does its work. People speak of defense, of honor, of historical destiny. The enemy is demonized, suffering is justified. And in that climate, the industrialist is no longer just a businessman. He becomes a symbol of national resistance, a soldier of production, someone who contributes to the front from the rear. That narrative is powerful, but also dangerous, because it creates an idea that producing weapons is a form of virtue. Meanwhile, enrichment becomes an unavoidable issue. War moves gigantic amounts of money. Military contracts mean enormous income. Some companies prosper even while the rest of the population suffers shortages. Wages are strained, prices rise, daily life becomes harder. And the question begins to float in the air, even if it is not always spoken aloud. Who is paying for this war, and who is profiting from it? In the First World War, that dilemma is not abstract. It is visible. Industrial cities grow in importance, but also in resentment. Workers see how more is demanded of them. They see how their working days are extended. They see how the state controls, but does not always protect. And under that pressure, another phenomenon appears. Industrial power grows larger, but also more vulnerable, because the legitimacy of that power begins to depend on something new. It is not enough to produce, you have to justify. And justification becomes difficult when the lists of the dead grow without stopping. This is where the documentary can show the historical trial we mentioned. Because war acts as a brutal test, it puts the industrial titans before a question they had never had to answer so clearly. Are they builders of progress or accomplices of destruction? The answer, as almost always in history, is not a single one. There are executives convinced they are doing what is necessary. There are engineers who focus on the technical problem and avoid looking at the human outcome. There are businessmen who see opportunity. There are others who feel the moral weight but carry on because stopping seems impossible. And there's an entire system pushing: the state, competition, fear of losing contracts, fear of losing the war, fear of disappearing. While the trenches stagnate, the factories cannot. War of attrition means exactly that. Whoever holds out longer, whoever produces more, whoever has more industrial capacity, has more chances of survival. Steel and electricity become weapons as important as any soldier, and when the end comes, it comes with a blunt blow: defeat, collapse, hunger, revolution. The German Empire falls. The world that had served as a framework for these giants changes abruptly. Suddenly, the question is no longer, how do we produce to win, but how do we survive in a humiliated, indebted, and politically unstable country? And for a moment, many people believe that this will drag down the great companies as well, that they will fall with the empire, as if they were an inseparable part of the old order. But there lies the uncomfortable lesson of industrial power. It can lose its flag and still remain standing. Because the factory, unlike the throne, does not need divine legitimacy. It needs demand, it needs capital, it needs adaptation. And if there was one thing these titans knew how to do, it was adapt. After the defeat, many thought these companies would fall with the empire. They were wrong. The defeat of 1918 was not only military, it was psychological, economic, and symbolic. For Germany, the end of the First World War meant something deeper than the loss of territories or the fall of the Kaiser. It meant the breaking of its story about itself. The country that had seen itself as a modern, efficient, disciplined power suddenly woke up in a world that pointed at it as guilty, defeated, and punished. The Treaty of Versailles was the legal frame of that humiliation. Reparations impossible to pay, military limitations, loss of strategic resources, international oversight. For the state, it was suffocation. For society, an open wound. And for industry, an existential challenge. Because the logic seemed clear. If the empire had fallen, if the army was dismantled, if the economy was under external controls, the great companies that had grown in the warmth of state and military power should fall with it. That was the narrative many expected. It was even the one some desired. But reality was more complex. Germany entered the 1920s as an exhausted country. Inflation spun out of control to almost surreal levels. Money lost its meaning. Wages were paid twice a day so they could be spent before they devalued. The savings of generations disappeared in a matter of weeks. The middle class felt betrayed. Poverty and resentment spread like a shadow. In that context, survival was no longer a matter of national pride. It was a matter of cold calculation. The great industrial companies faced a brutal dilemma. Either they adapted to a world without an empire, or they disappeared. There was no third option. Krupp is a good example of that tension. During the war, it had been a pillar of the war effort. After defeat, its link to militarism made it an obvious target for criticism, controls, and restrictions. Part of its production was limited. Its public image was degraded. The company lost contracts and international prestige. But Krupp was not just a cannon factory. It was a huge industrial system. And that system could not simply be switched off without provoking social collapse in entire regions. Thousands of workers depended on it. Whole infrastructures revolved around its activity. Even the victors understood that completely destroying that industry would destabilize the country even more. So a painful period of readjustment began. Staff cuts, closure of production lines, sale of assets, partial reorientation toward civil products, all under constant pressure, financial, political, social. The Krupp surname still carried weight, but now not as a symbol of power, rather as a reminder of an uncomfortable past. Siemens, for its part, faced a different but equally deep crisis. Electrification did not disappear with the war. On the contrary, reconstruction needed energy, communications, transport. But the internal market was broken, capital was scarce, and international trust in Germany was minimal. Siemens's response was not to resist change, but to accelerate transformation. It diversified, it sought foreign markets, it reorganized its internal structure, it made its management even more professional. It reinforced the idea that the company was something more than its founder and more than its country of origin. Siemens began to see itself as a global technical entity, not just a German company. That move was key. Because in the years of the Weimar Republic, many companies discovered that nationalism no longer guaranteed survival. Survival depended on flexibility, on exports, on constant innovation, even in a hostile environment. Hyperinflation forced quick and harsh decisions. Contracts were constantly renegotiated. Wages lost value from one day to the next. Workers lived with permanent insecurity. The companies that survived were those that managed to move faster than the chaos, those able to protect real assets, factories, machinery, knowledge, against the evaporation of money. This period also saw a rise in mergers, alliances, and quiet deals. Companies that had previously competed were forced to cooperate, or to absorb one another. The industrial fabric compacted. It became more resilient, but also more concentrated. Industrial power did not fragment, it hardened. Here it is worth pausing for a moment on the human side, because it is easy to talk about companies as if they were abstract entities. But behind every reorganization, there are people. Executives who go from planning expansion to managing cuts. Engineers who see their projects canceled. Workers who lose their jobs in a country where jobs are already scarce. Families who depend on decisions taken in closed offices. And still, something persists. The culture of efficiency. The idea that whatever happens, the problem can be analyzed, broken down, and solved. That mentality, forged over decades of industrialization, becomes a kind of psychological anchor for these companies. It does not guarantee success, but it allows them to withstand the storm. While Germany was falling apart, these companies were learning to survive without an empire. That sentence sums up the period better than any statistic. Because what is happening between 1918 and 1933 is not just an economic crisis, it is a transfer of power. Industrial power begins to understand that its survival cannot depend on one particular regime. It has to be compatible with any form of state. It has to be useful to a monarchy and to a republic alike, to a fragile democracy and to something darker. And that adaptation has a moral cost. Because in detaching themselves from the empire, companies do not become apolitical. They simply become pragmatic. They look for stability wherever they can find it. They support policies that promise order. They view chaos, inflation, and social conflict with suspicion. In that broth of discontent, something new grows. A discourse that promises to end humiliation, restore pride, impose order, reactivate industry, and give Germany a central place in the world again. A discourse that speaks the language of resentment, but also the language of efficiency. And for many companies exhausted by years of crisis, that discourse sounds tempting. Because it promises something very concrete, a predictable future. And then a regime arrived that promised to restore greatness at any price. For years, Germany had been a country living from day to day, not only economically, but emotionally. A nation with the constant feeling that it was about to break again. And when a political movement appears promising order, greatness, and stability, many people do not judge it as a moral project, but as a way out. The Nazi rise to power did not happen in a vacuum. It happened over a worn-out republic, over millions of unemployed people, over inflation still remembered as a collective nightmare, and over the humiliation that Versailles had turned into an identity. In that setting, the new regime understood something essential. If it wanted to truly dominate the country, it was not enough to control parliament, the police, or propaganda. It needed to control the machine. And the machine, in 20th century Germany, was no longer the monarchy. It was industry. For the great German conglomerates, the moment appeared as a crossroads that was not always experienced as a conscious decision. Many business leaders did not feel they were choosing a regime. They felt they were reacting to a fait accompli. The state changed, the client changed, but the logic of survival, of contracts, of continuity remained. And there the dangerous alliance was born. Because the regime offered something the Weimar Republic had not been able to offer in a sustained way: political stability, massive investment, an economic plan with clear objectives, and above all, demand. A huge amount of demand. Accelerated reindustrialization became a national priority. The state once again spent on infrastructures, transport, communications, heavy industry. And it did so with an aim that, at first, could be presented as modernization, but that gradually revealed its real destination: rearmament. This is where companies like Siemens and Krupp moved back to the center of the board, not because they had come back to life by magic, but because the state needed exactly what they knew how to do: produce fast, produce at scale, produce strategic technology, produce without asking too many questions. Siemens, with its experience in communications, electrification, and engineering, became a natural supplier to a state obsessed with control, logistics, and industrial capacity. Every network, every cable, every communication system could be civilian or military. The line is thinner than it seems, and the regime lives precisely by erasing those lines. Krupp, for its part, once again found a world in which its steel and machinery were not just useful, they were indispensable. The company already knew that almost symbiotic relationship with the Prussian state. What changed now was the scale and the moral nature of the project. Heavy industry became part of the regime's muscle, and that integration did not happen overnight. It was a progression: first contracts, then dependence, then internal adaptation, then normalization. Because there is a silent trap. When a company depends on a state in order to survive, it begins to think like the state. It begins to prioritize its objectives. It begins to justify what it would previously have questioned. And the regime also understood something else. If it wanted industry to work as an extension of power, it needed discipline, productivity, and labor control. That required a brutal transformation of work. After a certain point, German industry not only produced under an authoritarian regime, it produced inside a system of repression. Trade unions were eliminated or absorbed. Real negotiation disappeared. Protest became a risk. The worker became a cog. And when war began, that logic intensified. This is where the darkest and hardest part to tell appears, but it is impossible to ignore: forced labor. Millions of people in occupied Europe were used as manpower in factories, workshops, mines, industrial facilities. Industry, in many cases, benefited from that system, whether it requested it actively or accepted it as a solution the state placed on the table. Not all companies experienced that relationship in the same way, nor did all of them take the same decisions with the same degree of initiative. But the historical result is clear. German industrial power was integrated into a criminal system. And here, the documentary needs to pause for a second on the type of power we are describing. Because this is not just money or production, it is the capacity to transform societies. If an old dynasty controlled a country because it had an army and symbolic legitimacy, the modern industrialist controls it because he has infrastructure. Without steel, there is no railway. Without electricity, there are no factories. Without communications, there is no coordination. Without machinery, there is no war. In that sense, the industrialist becomes something like a minister without portfolio, or a king without a crown. He has influence because he can make the system work or stop, and the regime knows it. That is why in the Third Reich, the great industrialists are not secondary actors. They are gears. Sometimes accomplices by conviction, sometimes by opportunism, sometimes by fear, sometimes by a combination of everything. But gears nonetheless. And as the war advances, the relationship becomes even tighter. The state demands total production, industry demands resources, both feed each other. Results are measured in tons, in tanks, in cables, in ammunition, in locomotives. But behind every figure lies a devastating human reality. At this point, it is important to introduce a gentle rehook, not a "and now comes the shocking part," but a question that lingers like a shadow. What happens when a company survives by being useful to a regime, and then that regime falls? Because war does not only destroy cities, it destroys reputations, it destroys narratives. And when the Third Reich collapses, what will come is not only physical reconstruction, but historical judgment. And that judgment will not be abstract. It will have names, documents, accusations, courts. The question will no longer be, what did you produce, but for whom did you produce it, and at what price? And that is where the second life of these industrial dynasties begins, not as builders, but as survivors trying to rewrite their place in the world. In 1945, Germany was not only in ruins, its industry, the same that had driven progress, was left marked by an unavoidable question. How do you rebuild a country when the engine of your modernity has just been accused of feeding a tragedy? Ferdinand Porsche does not quite fit the classic figure of the German industrialist we have already seen. He is not, above all, a cold businessman or a factory patriarch. He is, first and foremost, an obsessive engineer, a man for whom speed, mechanics, and efficiency are not abstract concepts, but personal problems that demand a solution. He was born in 1875 in a world that still moved by horse and steam. He did not inherit a great fortune or a political position. His talent appeared early and clearly. He understood machines in an almost intuitive way. Where others saw loose parts, he saw complete systems. Where others sought stability, he sought improvement, more power, less weight, more reliability. From a very young age, Porsche showed something that would accompany him all his life: an extraordinary ability to turn complex technical ideas into real solutions. Electric motors, early hybrids, innovative designs. Even before he was famous, he was already respected in technical circles. He was not a man of speeches, he was a man of blueprints. And that matters, because it defines his relationship with power. Porsche did not chase ideology, he chased interesting problems. In the interwar years, when Germany lived between crises and resentment, the world of the automobile became a symbol of the future. Mobility, freedom, modernity. The car was not just a machine, it was a promise, and Porsche was convinced he could make that promise reality better than anyone else. Here, one of the most famous projects of his life appears: the people's car. The idea of an accessible, reliable vehicle produced in mass, technically brilliant, socially seductive, politically explosive. Because when the Nazi regime took power, it immediately understood the symbolic value of the automobile. A car for the masses was not just transport, it was propaganda, social cohesion, a demonstration of progress, and Porsche, with his indisputable talent, became the ideal person to materialize that dream. That is how Volkswagen was born. From a technical point of view, the project was a conceptual success. Efficient design, robust mechanics, production planned for scale. From a historical point of view, it is a gray zone that cannot be ignored. Porsche worked with the regime, he received support, he received resources, he received political backing, and in return, he put his ingenuity at the service of a state preparing for war and repression. He was not a frontline ideologue, he was not a fanatical orator, but he was not a passive observer either. There lies the moral ambiguity that defines his figure. Was he an opportunist? Was he a technician who simply did his job? Was he someone who believed, at least for a time, that he could separate engineering from the political use of his creations? History does not offer comfortable answers, it offers facts. During the war, civil projects were subordinated to the war effort. Factories were integrated into the war economy. The people's car was transformed into a military vehicle. And, as in other industrial cases, the system of forced labor extended there as well. Technical talent did not exist in a vacuum. It operated inside a system that decided how it would be used. And yet, there is something that differentiates Porsche from other industrialists of his time. He did not build a corporate empire during the war. He did not become a great manager of the productive apparatus. He remained, in essence, an engineer, a brilliant one, an obsessive one. One who, even in the worst possible context, kept thinking about performance, design, speed. When the war ended, that ambiguity came at a cost. Porsche was arrested by the French, not as an abstract symbol, but as a concrete person. He was interrogated, detained. His future was uncertain. The old German industrial world did indeed appear condemned, and he seemed part of it. And then something happened that connects directly with the idea of dynasty. Because Ferdinand Porsche did not disappear. His surname was not erased, his talent did not evaporate, and above all, his family understood something essential. Ingenuity can survive a regime if it adapts to the world that follows. After the war, the Porsche name reinvented itself. From engineer tied to a dark past, it became a synonym of technical excellence, speed, and aspirational design. The car ceased to be state propaganda and became an object of global desire. And there the true Porsche dynasty was born. Not a political dynasty, not a military dynasty. A business and symbolic dynasty. A surname that no longer represented a regime, but an idea of German engineering pushed to the limit. Precision, performance, prestige. But that transformation did not erase the past. It recontextualized it. It made it uncomfortable. Because behind every gleaming car, every race won, every luxury brand, there is a story that began in a time when talent was put at the service of something far darker. That is the emotional core of this part of the documentary. The same ingenuity that designed dreams of speed also served a brutal machine. And that sentence is not a simple condemnation. It is an invitation to understand how modern power works, how technical talent can be neutral in intention and devastating in consequence, how a person can be at the same time creator and accomplice without fitting neatly into any comfortable category. Because when the war ends, it is not just a conflict that ends. A moral framework ends, and what comes after forces everyone, states, companies, families, to redefine themselves. The war was over, and with it, the old German industrial world seemed condemned. 1945 is not just a year. It is a clean cut in German history. A before and after so radical that even words seem insufficient to describe it. The cities are in ruins, literally. Streets turned into rubble, factories bombed, infrastructures destroyed, millions of people displaced. The country that had bet everything on industrial and military strength wakes up surrounded by ashes. For many, that landscape seems like the definitive end, not only of a regime, but of an entire way of understanding power. The old German industrial world, now associated with war, destruction, and crime, seems doomed to disappear or at least be dismantled piece by piece. And for a time, that is exactly what happens. Trials arrive, investigations arrive, confiscations arrive. The victors not only want to punish political and military leaders, but also to dismantle the economic structures that made the war possible. German industry ceases to be a national pride and becomes a permanent suspect. The case of Krupp is the most symbolic. For decades, the surname had been synonymous with steel, power, industrial capacity. Now it is synonymous with militarism and complicity. Alfred Krupp, heir to the empire, is arrested and tried. He is accused of crimes related to the use of forced labor and of producing in the service of a criminal regime. The trial is not only legal, it is moral, it is historical. It is a clear message. Industrial power can no longer hide behind the excuse of just producing. The verdict is harsh: conviction, confiscation of assets. The Krupp Empire, as it was known, seems to come to an end. For a time, Krupp falls, not as a metaphor, but as reality. The company loses control, prestige, and autonomy. Its future is uncertain. Many believe it will never again occupy a central place, that this surname, so closely tied to steel and war, will be buried under the weight of its own past. Siemens goes through a different but equally profound process. There is no judicial collapse as spectacular, but there is an urgent need for transformation. The company has survived 2 world wars, but now finds itself in a divided, occupied, watched country. Its continuity depends on convincing the new authorities of something essential: that its technical knowledge can serve reconstruction, not destruction. Here, Siemens shows a skill it had already displayed before: reading the historical moment. The company reorganizes, it decentralizes, it distances itself as far as possible from its most compromised past. It focuses on civil energy, on communications for reconstruction, on basic infrastructures. It does not promise national greatness. It promises functionality. It promises usefulness. And that promise proves powerful. Because Germany, although defeated, desperately needs something to rebuild itself. It needs electricity, it needs transport, it needs communication, it needs factories that produce civil goods, and someone has to do it. Meanwhile, the figure of Ferdinand Porsche goes through his lowest point. After the war, he is arrested by the French authorities. He is not tried immediately, but spends months in prison. For an engineer obsessed with creation, confinement is a form of total annulment. His technical prestige does not protect him. His past weighs heavily. His future seems uncertain. And yet, even at that moment, talent does not disappear. The designs exist. The ideas are still there. The Porsche surname has not spoken its last word, even if no one knows it yet. This is the turning point of the documentary. Because if we look at the landscape of 1945 without knowing what will come after, everything points to definitive collapse. Germany is divided, its industry is dismantled or controlled, its elites are discredited, its future seems limited, watched, reduced to basic survival. But history rarely follows the most obvious path. Amid the ruins, something begins to take shape that has no name yet. It is not national pride. It is not revenge. It is something colder and more practical, the need to function, to produce, to stabilize, to avoid total chaos. And in that context, the same companies that had been seen as part of the problem begin, little by little, to be seen as part of the solution. Not because of immediate moral redemption, not because the past is forgotten, but for a brutally simple reason. They know how to do what needs to be done. They know how to organize production. They know how to manage technology. They know how to turn limited resources into operating systems. Where others see only ruins, some begin to see reusable structures. Where others see punishment, some see reorganization. Where others see the end of an era, some sense the beginning of another. This moment is uncomfortable because it forces a question that runs through all modern history. What do we do with knowledge when it has been used for evil? Do we destroy it? Do we bury it? Or do we reuse it in the hope that context will transform it? Germany, and with it its great companies, faces that question in 1945. And the answer will not be immediate, nor clean, nor morally perfect. It will be gradual, pragmatic, and for many, surprising. Because as the country tries to get up among the rubble, something begins to become clear. The future is not going to be built with speeches, but with systems that work. And there, precisely there, is where these industrial dynasties once again find their place. But where others saw ruins, some saw future. After 1945, Germany not only has to rebuild buildings, it has to rebuild something much harder: trust. Internal trust between citizens who have survived the catastrophe, external trust with a world that looks at that country with suspicion, with weariness, and with fear. And yet, in barely a generation, something happens that had seemed impossible. West Germany goes from devastation to becoming an economic power. It will be called the economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder. But if you look closely, it is not a miracle in the romantic sense. It does not fall from the sky. It is not magic. It is a combination of historical conditions and concrete decisions, reforms, foreign aid, political stability, a population hungry for normality, and an industry that, despite everything, retains something essential: the capacity to produce and organize. The first image of rebirth is not a flag or a parade. It is something more prosaic: light returning to the streets, machines running, trains moving, telephone lines reconnecting. And there, Siemens appears as one of the great silent symbols of the new world. Siemens is no longer just a big company. It is an organism that adapts to the language of the post-war period: reconstruction, energy, electrification, infrastructure, export. Instead of promising national power, it promises stability. Instead of feeding the logic of the state needs weapons, it feeds the logic of society needs services. In practice, Siemens becomes a kind of technical backbone of the reborn country. Not because it is the only one, but because it represents an idea the new Germany wants to sell to the world. We are useful, we are efficient, we are reliable. The key word is that reliable. Germany tries to change its image, and it does so in the most German possible way, by proving it can build systems that work. In parallel, something equally important happens, but on a more emotional level: the rebirth of consumption, of desire, and of aspiration. Because a society emerging from war does not only need to eat and have a roof, it also needs to believe that the future can be more than survival. And there Porsche enters almost as a cultural symbol. Porsche is not reborn as a company that talks about history or politics. It is reborn as a brand that sells a promise: speed, design, modernity, precision. It is a different kind of power, less institutional and more intimate. It does not rule from ministries, it rules from the imagination. And the curious thing is that for Porsche to become Porsche, Germany also has to become something new. A country where industry is not tied to a totalitarian project, but to a democratic and capitalist project. Where production is not an extension of the military state, but an extension of the civil economy. Here the great unwritten pact of post-war Germany appears: industry plus democracy. It is not a perfect moral pact. It does not mean the past disappears. It means the country accepts something pragmatic. It needs strong companies to support employment, exports, and social stability. And companies accept something equally pragmatic. The new political framework no longer allows them to act as an autonomous power that merges with the state. There are rules, there are unions, there is oversight, there are democratic institutions, there are limits. That new social contract is part of the engine of the miracle. And it is also a kind of historical rebranding. Germany no longer presents itself as a nation of conquest, but as a nation of production. It is no longer feared, it seeks to be respected. And in that change, the old industrial surnames reappear, but with another face. This is where the documentary can once again touch the emotional thread. The surnames return, but not as feudal lords or suppliers of state militarism, but as symbols of economic success within a democratic system. Siemens stops being a name associated with the machinery of war and becomes a name associated with European modernization, with power plants, with automation, with technology applied to civil life. It is as if the company, without erasing its history, learned to tell it in a different way. We are not the past, we are the future. And Porsche becomes something even more psychological. It is no longer just the surname of an engineer with moral ambiguities, but the brand that represents a new status. On a rebuilding continent, owning a sports car is not just luxury. It is proof that life has once again become larger than war. And while these companies grow, Europe changes around them. New institutions are built, markets are integrated. An idea of economic cooperation appears that tries to make another total war impossible. And German companies become pillars of that project because they produce, export, and connect economies. Industry is no longer just a national matter, it is a continental matter. Here, there is a key moment. Industrial power ceases to be only capacity to manufacture and becomes capacity to define standards. What is produced, how it is produced, with what quality, with what precision, with what reliability. And that, in the post-war period, is a huge form of power because the whole of Europe needs to rebuild and modernize. In short, the factory does not just return, the factory becomes legitimacy. And then, almost without our noticing, the most important turn of the European 20th century happens. Power ceases to depend on lineage and comes to depend on competitiveness. No longer rules whoever has a coat of arms, but whoever has the most efficient production chain, the most advanced engineering, the most convincing capacity to export. But that transformation has a cost. The past never disappears completely. It remains as a shadow. As an uncomfortable question, how much of this was redemption and how much was pragmatic reinvention? Even so, from the outside, the image is clear. Germany is back, and it returns not as an empire, but as an economic engine. The surnames return, but transformed. As if they had learned to survive by changing their skin, they no longer present themselves as masters of national destiny, but as architects of everyday progress. And there, with that new industrial identity, history moves into a different phase. It is no longer just about rebuilding. It is about dominating the future. Factories no longer ruled with fear, but with efficiency. For much of the 20th century, power had been measured in very concrete terms: territory, army, natural resources. But as Europe is rebuilt and the world enters a new phase of interconnection, that criterion begins to become obsolete. Power no longer depends only on imposing will, but on attracting, on convincing, on being desired. And it is in that field that the great German companies make a silent but decisive leap. Globalization does not arrive in one blow. It seeps in little by little in the form of exports, trade agreements, shared technical standards, and when that happens, some brands begin to stand out almost naturally. Not because they shout louder, but because they fit perfectly with what the new world needs: reliability, precision, consistency. Germany, which for decades had been seen as a dangerous power, begins to be perceived differently. No longer as a threat, but as a supplier. A country that does not impose political models, but technical solutions. And within that new image, certain companies become more than businesses, they become symbols. Siemens is a clear example. From a national company, it becomes a global presence. Its technologies appear in power plants, transport systems, hospitals, factories across half the world, not always with its name visible to the ordinary citizen, but always at the heart of critical systems. Siemens does not sell emotion, it sells trust. And in an increasingly complex world, trust is an extraordinary form of power. When a country decides to modernize its infrastructure, when a city needs stable energy, when a railway network must run without room for error, technical prestige turns into influence. There are no flags, no grandiloquent speeches. There are contracts, standards, long-term maintenance. It is a form of presence much more lasting than military occupation. Porsche, on the other hand, plays in another register of soft power. It does not operate in silence. It operates in desire. The German sports car becomes an aspirational object worldwide. It does not represent the state, nor even heavy industry. It represents an idea: extreme performance, impeccable design, engineering pushed to the limit. Here something interesting happens. The Porsche surname stops being perceived as German in a political sense and starts being perceived as universal. It does not matter whether the car is driving in California, Japan, or the Middle East. It communicates the same thing: technical excellence turned into status. That is the core of soft power, when your product needs no ideological explanation, when its value is understood almost instinctively, when buying it is a way of participating in a positive story. And thus, without armies or conquests, these companies begin to influence the way the world sees Germany. It is no longer the country of the world wars. It is the country of reliable engineering, solid industry, functional design, elevated to excellence. This change is not minor. For centuries, Europe exported power through colonies, armies, and dynasties. Now it exports standards, it exports technology, it exports brands. And those brands, though private, end up functioning as cultural ambassadors. An engineer trained with Siemens technology in Asia or Latin America, without realizing it, adopts a German way of understanding efficiency. A consumer who aspires to a Porsche adopts a very concrete idea of quality and performance. It is not direct propaganda, it is something more subtle. It is influenced through repetition and experience. And here lies the documentary's great historical twist. These companies no longer need the explicit backing of the state to wield power. In fact, their strength lies precisely in appearing independent, technical, apolitical. The more neutral they seem, the more trustworthy they become. This does not mean power disappears, it means it changes shape. Before, industrial power needed the state to grow. Now the state needs these companies to compete in a globalized world: infrastructure, innovation, exports, qualified jobs. The balance is reversed. And that balance is summed up in a sentence that encapsulates an entire era. They no longer needed armies, the world came to buy from them. Not because they were cheaper, not because they dominated by decree, but because they had built something harder: a reputation. Reputation is slow to create and quick to lose. And that is why these industrial dynasties care for their image with an almost dynastic obsession. They do not just sell products, they sell continuity. They sell a story of excellence that seems to pass through generations without breaking. Here, the arc that began with solitary engineers, modest workshops, and factories at the service of the state closes. What we see now is the final result. Companies turned into global symbols, capable of influencing economies, cultures, and aspirations without needing to control governments. But this power, precisely because it is so diffuse, raises one last uncomfortable question. If they no longer rule with crowns or cannons, who watches those who rule with standards, technology, and desire? That question is not yet answered, because it belongs to the present, and perhaps to the future. If you look at 19th century Europe, power still has a clear aesthetic: palaces, uniforms, titles, genealogies. If you look at 20th century Europe, that aesthetic changes, but the deep logic, who decides, who inherits, who remains, does not disappear. It just puts on a disguise. And that is where the most uncomfortable idea of the whole documentary comes in. When crowns lose weight, the concept of dynasty does not die. It moves. Because in the end, a dynasty is not just blue blood. It is continuity. It is a system designed to last longer than a single person. It is a way of concentrating resources, protecting them, and transferring them without letting them thin out over time. And that is exactly what many German and European in general business families learned to do. In the aristocratic world, the surname was an asset. In the corporate world, the surname can be won too, but in another way, tied to reputation, control, ownership. The symbols change, but the mechanism looks more like what we want to admit. Think of what happened in a classic noble house. A founder amassed lands and privileges. Then came the central problem of any lineage: how to stop all that from coming apart over the generations. Then tools appeared: strategic marriages, pacts, organized inheritance, internal rules, alliances with the state, closed social networks. Now change lands to shares, change castles to boards of directors, change titles to positions of control, and you are left with something very familiar. Many of the great German companies are not just firms, they are structures where ownership and power remain in small circles. Some are born as family businesses, and although they grow into global giants, they retain elements reminiscent of an old court: internal hierarchies, loyalties, their own culture, control of the narrative, and an obsession with legacy. The word legacy is key. In the aristocracy, legitimacy came from history. My family has always ruled here. In the modern company, legitimacy comes from performance, yes, but also from narrative. We are the firm that built this. We are the ones who made that possible. Our name is synonymous with quality. The past becomes a shield, a brand, an argument. And here, the issue of succession enters, because if there is a point where the parallel becomes obvious, it is this: the question of who inherits power. In monarchies, the problem was biological and political. If there was no heir, there was crisis. If the heir was weak, there were conspiracies. If the heir was not accepted, there was revolution. In business dynasties, the problem is different, but just as real. Who is in control? Who is in charge when the founder is gone? Who sets the course when there is no longer a single central figure, but an entire family, shareholders, executives, banks, regulators? And as in old noble houses, the solution is rarely improvised. It is planned. Legal structures are armored. Ownership stakes are distributed in a calculated way. Foundations, holdings, internal pacts are created to ensure power does not leak through unexpected cracks. Inheritance stops being a private matter and becomes an architecture. Something else also appears that the aristocracy knew well: the tension between the interests of the lineage and the interests of the country. Before, a king could be sovereign of a territory, but think as a member of his house. Today, a big company can be a national pride, but answer to its own logic of survival and global expansion. Decisions move between two worlds: public discourse and internal strategy. And at that point, the viewer begins to see clearly that contemporary power looks less like a parliament of ideas and more like a board of continuity. Democracy chooses governments, yes. But large economic structures usually move on longer timescales, with decade-long objectives, with plans that cross crises, Cold Wars, globalizations, and cultural shifts. The most interesting thing is that these new elites have an advantage old noble houses did not always have. They can reinvent themselves without losing everything. A monarchy that fell lost legitimacy. A company can change sector, image, strategy, and remain alive. It can even say sorry, rewrite its narrative, invest in new markets, align itself with new values. It is a kind of adaptability that makes corporate dynasties, in some senses, more resilient than royal dynasties. But that resilience has a price. The bigger and more symbolic they become, the harder it is to separate the brand from the history. Because history weighs, and sometimes it comes back. Here, the documentary connects with what we have already seen. Siemens, Krupp, Porsche, not only as companies, but as surnames that outlive generations, that bear reputations, that defend themselves, that transform, that inherit not only wealth, but also shadows. And then comes the point where everything fits. Modernity did not destroy dynastic logic, it industrialized it. There may no longer be coronations, but there are successions. There may no longer be official noble titles, but there are networks of influence. There may no longer be divine right, but there is a kind of authority built on assets, reputation, and control. And if this is true, then the question is not just historical, it is current. Because if these business families are new dynasties, then sooner or later they will face the same problem nobles faced for centuries. The world changes, society demands other things, legitimacy is questioned, crises hit, and the lineage has to decide whether it adapts or breaks. But every dynasty faces the same question: can it survive the world it helped create? In the 19th century, industrial power could hide behind a very simple idea: progress. If you built railways, lit cities, manufactured steel, it was easy to present yourself as an almost inevitable force of modernity. But the 21st century, and in reality, already since the late 20th, changes the rules of the game. Because power is no longer measured only by what you produce, but by what you cause. And that is where even the most solid business dynasties discover something unsettling. The modern world does not only buy products, it also demands explanations. For decades, many of these great German and European companies built a prestige that seemed bulletproof: quality, engineering, reliability. It was a reputation so strong it worked almost like a shield. But contemporary crises have shown that no shield is eternal, and that, when the public spotlight comes on, the surname, instead of protecting, can become a target. First, come the financial crises. Not only the big recessions that shake markets and destroy jobs, but also the moments when the fragility of entire models is revealed. Investment decisions that seemed sensible until they stopped being so. Aggressive expansions, dependence on global supply chains, levels of debt that in good times looked strategic and in bad times look like sentences. In that context, the myth of the Titan cracks. The public discovers that even giants can tremble. Then come the ethical crises. And here the word dynasty takes on another tone. Because when a company is involved in questionable practices, bribes, market manipulation, unfair labor treatment, opaque deals with governments, the question that appears is not only what did the company do, but who allowed it. And when the company is associated with a surname, suspicion becomes more personal. As if power had a face, as if responsibility had a name and inheritance. To that you must add the contemporary minefield, the environment. In the 20th century, pollution could be seen as an inevitable cost of industrialization. In the 21st century, that cost becomes a moral account. Society begins to demand something it did not demand with the same intensity before, that those who got rich building the modern world also bear the consequences of the world they left behind. And suddenly, what once was national pride turns into permanent public debate. This pressure does not come only from governments or courts. It comes from people, social networks, media, organizations, consumers. Control of the narrative, which for so long lay in corporate hands, press releases, spokespeople, image campaigns, becomes harder. A crisis is no longer managed in weeks, it is managed in minutes. A scandal can jump from a document to a hashtag before the company has had time to react. And that wrong foots even structures used to thinking in decades. Because here lies the clash. Business dynasties were formed with a long-term mentality, but today's public opinion operates with a logic of immediacy. And when those two speeds collide, reputation, that invisible capital that takes generations to build, can erode with brutal speed. And then generational changes appear. This is a key point, because it is not only a matter of outward image, but of internal identity. The founders and industrial patriarchs, those who lived through wars, reconstruction, scarcity, had an almost religious vision of work, discipline, sacrifice, control. Their heirs, or the heirs of their heirs, grow up in a different world. A world where prestige is not earned just by manufacturing, but by meeting ethical standards, being transparent, being sustainable, being diverse. For some, that is a natural evolution. For others, it is a threat. And there, a silent tension appears, the conflict between preserving the legacy as it was and transforming it to survive. And when a family company or a large brand tied to a surname enters that tension, something very similar to what happened in old monarchies can occur. Internal disputes, struggles for control, factions, opposing strategies. Only here, it is not a throne that is being disputed. It is a board of directors. It is not a crown that is at stake. It is a block of shares, a foundation, a voting right. Moreover, the technological world introduces another kind of fragility. For a long time, heavy industry was synonymous with power because it was hard to replace. But digital technology changes the hierarchy. Young companies can grow faster than old empires. Innovation is no longer guaranteed by history, but by speed. And that forces industrial giants to move in an uncomfortable terrain, competing in a world where reputation matters, yes, but is not enough if you fall behind. And here comes the sentence that defines this part. The surname no longer protects as much. Before, the name could work as a seal of trust. Now it can work as an open file. Because the better known the surname, the easier it is for the public to connect past and present. And in the case of the great German industrial dynasties, that means something especially delicate. Their stories are crossed by the most violent century in Europe. And the 21st century not only remembers, it reevaluates. In the end, contemporary fragility has a cruel element. These companies and families can do many things right, can adapt, can reform, and still live under permanent suspicion, because in today's world, power must justify itself every day, as if the trial never ended. And yet, the truly striking thing is that, despite all this, crises, scandals, social pressure, cultural changes, technological competition, many of these industrial dynasties remain standing, some more discreet, some more transformed, some trying to erase shadows, others embracing the narrative of reinvention. But there they are, and still they are there. Today, when we look at Europe, we no longer see coronations or imperial proclamations. There are no emperors parading down newly built avenues, no monarchs deciding the fate of millions with a signature. And yet the continent continues to function, continues to produce, continues to connect and move thanks to very concrete power structures. Structures that do not wear crowns, but that influence daily life in a deep and constant way. Companies like Siemens or Porsche are no longer simply manufacturers. They are nodes of structural power. They design infrastructures, set standards, define technological rhythms. Their decisions do not appear on political front pages, but they affect how energy circulates, how transport moves, how we understand innovation, and even how we imagine success. They do not govern countries, but they condition entire systems. Siemens does not pass laws, but its technologies support hospitals, power grids, trains, factories, smart cities. When a modern society functions without asking why it functions, there are almost always companies like this behind it, operating in silence. That is a particularly effective kind of power, invisible when everything goes well, obvious only when it fails. Porsche, on another plane, does not organize infrastructures, but organizes aspirations. It represents an idea of technical excellence, of status, of identity attached to performance. It needs no national speeches or political symbols. Its influence filters into culture, advertising, the way success is visually represented. It is symbolic power turned into global desire. And when you put both models together, silent structural power and aspirational power, a disturbingly familiar figure appears, that of a stable elite, heir to itself, capable of influencing for generations, not through armies, but through systems, not through forced obedience, but through functional dependence. This is where the documentary links up with the wider present, because these industrial dynasties do not exist in a vacuum. They now coexist with new elites, technological, financial, digital, founders of platforms, owners of data, architects of algorithms, people who also do not need crowns but who influence elections, markets, narratives, and behaviors on a scale unimaginable a century ago. The difference is aesthetic, not structural. Before, power was inherited through blood. Today, it is inherited through shares, control of intellectual property, networks of influence, and privileged access to capital and knowledge. Before, the symbol was the crown. Today, it is the logo, the patent, the platform, the technological standard. And that leads us inevitably to the uncomfortable questions that close this journey. Are these companies the new dynasties? Have we replaced kings with boards of directors? Do we really live in a world where power is more widely distributed? Or did it simply learn to dress up as technical neutrality? Because if we look at the whole story, from the solitary engineers of the 19th century through war, collapse, reconstruction, and globalization, we see a clear pattern. Power does not disappear. It adapts. It changes language. It changes symbols. It changes its justification. The old dynasties said they ruled by divine right. The new ones say they influence through efficiency, innovation, and the market. But both share something essential: the ability to last, to get through crises, to reinvent themselves, to remain relevant when everything around them changes. And perhaps that is the true mystery of modern power. Not who rules today, but who will still be influencing tomorrow. Not the names that occupy headlines, but the structures that remain when those names are gone. Europe no longer bows before emperors, but it still runs on the machines they once imagined. Power changed its shape, not its nature.